Chapter 20. "Where am I?" Owen asked. "You're with us," a gentle voice answered. Owen recognized the voice, but he couldn't see who had spoken. He couldn't see anything but white light. "Alyssa?" "Yes, Owen, it's me." "But you're dead." "Not really dead, just changed into something else." "Don't forget me," a male voice chimed in.
"Daniel?"
Owen was ecstatic.
"Where are we?" "A place where all energy goes when it loses its physical form. It's not so bad, actually."
Alyssa sounded like she truly meant it. "Why can't I see anything?" Owen asked, a little worried. "Because you're not supposed to be here yet," Daniel responded. "You still have a physical form, unlike us. You're here temporarily. Your body is recovering. The supplement thingy took a lot of energy since it wasn't meant to be used by anyone other than Arminus."
"And before you go back,"
Alyssa said,
"there's something you should know about us, and about yourself. Though you won't remember it after you return, you'll still know."
Chris pulled a chair up to the bed, opened the first book, and began reading aloud. He vowed long ago to get Owen into this series about the young wizard, but Owen had been stubborn. Not today, though. Today, he would listen while Chris read, and there wasn't a damn thing Owen could do about it. He read, and in 2 days, he'd finished the first book and was on to the second. He noticed Owen getting skinnier by the day, but kept reading. He knew he should have taken his friend to the hospital, but deep down he knew the doctors couldn't do anything for Owen. He just had to wait it out. Daniel and Alyssa told Chris so. So he kept reading. He read the last word on the last page of the 7th book, then closed it and patted the hardcover. When he looked up, he saw Owen staring back at him. Everyone piled into the guest room a few minutes later. Chris had told them Owen was awake. There stood Doug, Curtis, Cullen, Vanessa, baby Sydney, and someone else Owen and Chris only faintly recognized. It was Officer Patrick Fisher, and he looked nervous among them. Chris had met him a long time ago when he and Alyssa had gone on a date. "It's nice to see you're awake, Mr. Walters," Patrick said. "I think congratulations are in order. You saved the world, after all." "I think we all did," Owen said, this time louder and clear enough for everyone to hear. "Including you." Patrick grinned and nodded. "It's true, I was amazing." Everyone laughed. Baby Sydney gave a giggle. "The blue giant has disappeared," Patrick said. "A few weeks ago, something appeared in the sky and just lifted the thing up and out of sight. I guess it was the aliens." Owen smiled knowingly. "Also, we went to the farmhouse," Patrick continued, looking at Curtis and Doug, "and found the bodies of those 2 boys you told me about. Even though they're dead, we know from their fingerprints that they were the ones who murdered Marco Garcia, Alyssa Turner, David Hernandez, and several others. The only question is, who killed them?" The room grew quiet. Almost everyone knew it had been Owen who had taken the brothers out in brutal fashion. But did Officer Fisher know as well? "I'll take care of everything," Patrick said, as if reading everyone's minds. "But you and I will need to talk soon, Mr. Walters." Owen nodded. "Who were they?" Doug asked. "No one knows. We can't find any records of them anywhere." Patrick frowned. "I guess they weren't from around here." Owen shuddered at the phrase that was oh so similar to what Jason had told him earlier. If they weren't from around here, where were they from? Owen was looking better now that he was eating again. Doug and Curtis were sitting on the couch in the living room, Doug playing a video game. Kingdom Souls 2, his brother's favorite, and Curtis drawing in his notebook. He'd been doing that for weeks now. The whole notebook looked like a comic book version of the events that played out with the giants, leeches, zombies, and the brothers Jason and Michael. There were even versions of Owen, Chris, Doug, and the others. Owen was eating in the dining room with Chris. Doug and Curtis refused to leave Owen's side until he was back to his old self, which he was managing pretty quickly now that he was awake. The Matthewses didn't mind much because they had babysitters for Sydney while they were away at work and school. Life was returning to normal. Officer Fisher stopped by every now and then to ask questions about the brothers. Once, Owen asked Patrick whether his fingerprints on the axe, knife, and hammer would be a problem. Patrick only said, "Don't worry about it." "There's something I want to show you when you're up to it," Chris said as they ate their breakfast at the table. Owen nodded and looked over at Dee, who was standing in a corner in the living room. No one knew how to recharge the poor robot. Even though Owen himself had controlled Dee with the help of the supplement, if the robot hadn't been there, Owen might be dead now. He owed Dee his life. The next day, Owen claimed he was ready for whatever Chris wanted to show him. They drove Doug's car, which they had retrieved from Les's neighborhood weeks ago, to a small 2-story building in downtown San Sebastian, on Cooper Street. The destruction caused by Blue was nearly cleaned up completely a few blocks away. Owen and Chris entered the building, which was surprisingly unlocked, and looked around. It had a pretty spacious lobby, and wasn't yet furnished, except for a desk on the right. "What is this place?" Owen asked. "It's going to be a homeless shelter," Chris said. "It was Alyssa's. She invested a lot of money into it." Owen walked around carefully on legs that looked likely to collapse. Chris wanted to help him around, but Owen insisted on walking himself. "How long have you known about this place?" Owen asked. Chris noticed something in his voice when he asked this question. It sounded like irritation. "Time's a little fuzzy with me now," Chris pointed to his head. "But she told me right before she and Daniel went to David's party that night." "She told you and not me?" Chris understood now why Owen sounded the way he did. "I caught her looking over some papers. She was going to surprise us when it was ready, but—" Silence filled the lobby. An appropriate silence. Owen understood. "Did she go in this alone?" Owen said. "Or did she have a partner?" "She had a partner," a voice said behind them. They whirled around to see a young African-American woman standing at the entrance. She was dressed in a white dress shirt and tan skirt. She looked very businesslike. She stepped forward and took Chris's hand. "I'm Jacole Brighton." Owen walked up to her and shook her hand as well. Jacole had beautiful brown eyes, and her shiny black hair was pulled back in a ponytail. "You must be Owen and Chris," she said with a smile. "Alyssa told me all about you." "I wish we could say the same," Chris said in as friendly a way as possible. "How did you know Alyssa?" "College. Alyssa was a very kind spirit, always helping people, and her love for animals was noteworthy." Owen and Chris smiled at that. "I'm very sorry to hear what happened." Owen and Chris said nothing, only nodded. "It may please you to know," Jacole continued, "that the Turner Brighton house is still scheduled to open soon, and I plan to put up a portrait of her for everyone to see, so they'll know who made this place possible." Chris was tearing up now, and quickly wiped his eyes before anyone could see. Owen didn't bother hiding his tears. "Something tells me that after the events a few weeks ago," Jacole said, "it wouldn't hurt to offer a helping hand to those who need it." Next, Chris took Owen to a graveyard just outside of the city. He told Owen about the funerals for Daniel and Alyssa that had taken place during Owen's coma. They walked up a grassy hill and found Daniel's grave there. Alyssa's funeral had taken place in Houston, where she was from. Daniel's headstone read, Daniel Ray Hudson, beloved brother and son. There were flowers around the headstone. Owen cried all over again. Chris patted him on the back. After a few minutes, Owen stopped crying and looked at the headstone again. He wrestled with the idea of telling Chris what Nikki had told him about how Alyssa and Daniel were more than just human, then decided not to. After dropping Owen off at Collins, Chris asked Doug if he could borrow the car to run one more errand. He drove to a house in Haltom City. At first, he was too nervous to approach the front door. The last time he was here, Becky Simon had come upon the unconscious body of her best friend Stephanie Polanski. Luckily, he was able to convince her that he hadn't been the one to harm Stephanie. He had gone to the hospital first, only to find Stephanie had been released a week prior. He knocked on the door, and Becky answered a moment later. She studied him up and down for a second, then said, "What are you doing here?" She was holding a bottle of tea, just like she'd been when Chris first met her. Her brown hair was hanging loosely in curls, her blue eyes piercing into him. Then someone pushed Becky aside to stand at the door. It was Stephanie. She was pale and a lot skinnier than when he had last seen her, but she was smiling. Her beautiful brown hair was pulled back from her face, and he could see the girl he had loved since high school, even if she still barely remembered him from that time. When he first saw her lying in that bathtub weeks ago, nearly dead after Eric's attack, Chris's heart had torn in two. He'd loved her ever since he first saw her in school, and he hated seeing her hurt. He'd thought that he would never get the chance to tell her how he felt about her, like Owen had suggested he do. Chris was about to say hello when Stephanie was suddenly upon him, kissing his lips. Her arms were around his neck, and she was pulling herself up to him. He wrapped his arms around her to help. Becky rolled her eyes and left them on the front porch. They kissed for a long time. After spending time with Stephanie and telling her all that had happened to him and his friends, and possibly herself, since she was part of the zombie soldiers, Chris returned to Birch, making sure to fill up the gas tank before getting to Collins. He and Owen didn't say much to each other after he got there. Everyone sat at the table for dinner, staring at each other in silence. The tension was thick between Chris and Owen, though the others didn't know what it was about. "These hamburgers are awesome," Doug said to Colin and Vanessa, startling everyone. "I helped grill them," Curtis added, as if his feelings were hurt by the exclusion. Everyone laughed. And then everything got quiet again. Colin was feeding Sydney baby food, peaches and green beans, while taking bites of his hamburger. "I've decided to finish high school," Owen said. Chris's eyes darted to Owen's in that instant. Owen was already staring back, as if daring Chris to say something. "That's great, Owen," Vanessa said. "What made you decide that?" "Colin and I talked it over. He convinced me it was a good idea. Since I missed out on most of high school," Owen looked away from Chris as he said this, "I figured it would be cool to get that experience. I want to walk across a stage to get my diploma, like everybody else." Everyone except Chris was nodding and smiling. Chris thought it was a good idea, as well, but he felt incredibly guilty. If it hadn't been for him, Owen would have finished high school. Everything was Chris's fault. Daniel's and Alyssa's deaths, Owen's fractured childhood. Chris got up from the table and walked into the living room. Everyone watched him go. Everyone but Owen. In the living room, Chris sat on the couch and stared at Dee in the corner. With Daniel and Alyssa dead, and Owen going back to school, Chris wondered where that left him. He knew it was selfish of him to have these thoughts right now, but he no longer had a place to call home, and he couldn't fathom going back to the streets. Just then, Owen sat down next to him. "I'm sorry," he said.
Don't be, said Chris. You're doing the right thing. I'm proud of you, in fact.
Owen smiled at that.
You know, I have a big old house now. It's got plenty of rooms. You can live with me.
Chris pondered this for a moment. It was as if Owen was reading his mind, and wouldn't doubt it considering Michael had been able to read Owen's once before. Then he said, "Will you help me kill that monster, Arminus's test subject?" Owen's smile faded. "I don't know, Chris. I'm just a normal person now. I'm not super strong anymore. I don't want to do any of that. I want to have a normal life." Owen had told him about the supplement, and about how his dad really died. "You're scared, aren't you?" Chris asked, not unkindly.
"Yes, I am."
Chris nodded. "I understand. That's why we can't live together." He got up and walked over to Dee. "I'm going to need him, though."
"You'll have to talk to Doug,"
Owen said.
"It's fine,"
a voice said from the hall. It was Doug. Curtis stood next to him.
"It's fine, because we want to help, Curtis and me."
Owen looked back at them for a while, then turned to Chris. "There you go," he said quietly, as if giving Chris his blessing to continue the monster hunting game without him.
"I can't believe you two,"
Sunita said to Daniel and Alyssa by the blue waterfall.
"First you save those two boys, Curtis and Doug. Then you keep Owen alive for weeks, using so much of your own energy to do so. It was so selfless."
Daniel and Alyssa, both of whom had been looking at the snow-white ground in shame, suddenly looked up at the smiling woman.
"What you have done, no one has ever done before,"
Sunita continued in a less harsh tone than when she started.
"I want to thank you for keeping my son alive during his ordeal. I only wish I had been able to do so myself, as a mother should." "You would have, if you'd known how,"
Alyssa said kindly.
"We can teach you,"
Daniel added.
"It's not too hard."
Sunita's smile vanished.
"You kids are messing with the laws of nature. Your intentions may be noble, but this isn't something you should do often." "But if we can stop people from dying,"
Daniel began. Sunita held up a hand, silencing him.
"You can't stop death. You can only delay it. Everyone on the planet will die someday, no matter what we do here. I'm sorry, kids, but that's just the way it is."
Daniel and Alyssa were silent after that. They had gone from shameful to proud and then to depressed all within a minute. It didn't feel good. All they had wanted to do was help their friends on Earth, even if it meant using all of their energy to do so. But what would happen if there was no more energy to give? Perhaps Mrs. Walters was right. Sunita cleared her throat.
"Now, if it's okay with you two, do you mind teaching me how you saved your friends?"
Daniel and Alyssa smiled again.
"Lucky you want to learn,"
Daniel said, "because we're tapped out."
"What do you mean?"
Sunita asked.
"We don't have any more energy to give,"
Alyssa said.
"We couldn't help our friends again if we tried. If they ever need help, they're out of luck."
The lesson began. This has been Invaders' Wrath, The Unstoppable Titans, Book 2, written and read by Jerry Hart.